By the dawn of the 20th century, planet Earth had surrendered most of its secrets. Man had taken the measure of his world. He had explored all available earthly frontiers. And so, man turned his attention toward the stars. America's leading space pioneer was a New England physics professor named Robert Goddard. 23 years after the Wright brothers flew the first airplane, Goddard invented the first liquid fuel rocket. His initial test flights over the New England countryside appear rather primitive by today's standards. Nonetheless, they ushered in an era known as the Space Age. During World War II, a brilliant young German scientist named Wernher von Braun was also shooting for the stars. More often than not, however, his V-2 rockets hit London instead. After the war, von Braun joined the U.S. space team, knowing full well that his highly sophisticated V-2 arsenal had fallen into Russian hands.
I would not be at all surprised to be hearing a human voice from outer space that will have an unmistakable Russian accent.
Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the first man in outer space. Quickly, the United States rolled its available rocket technology into service. But with each Russian success came a new American fiasco. The men behind these ill-fated missions were young and untested, brilliant in the classroom, but lacking in practical experience. It was a case of the American spirit being willing, but American technology being sadly deficient.
Control here, we've got green lights across the board and all systems are go. Check that.
The era of failure soon came to an end. In 1960, America elected as president the youthful John F. Kennedy. Kennedy listened to von Braun outline the future of space exploration. Then he formulated the plan that would launch mankind toward its greatest achievement.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
The great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
The moon, strange silver ball in the sky. full of romance and superstition. Once she was remote, the province of poets and shepherds. Now she became the focus of a nation's pride.
Clearly, the Russians had thrown down the gauntlet. They had given us the challenge. Was the United States able to compete technologically with the Russians in this new arena, the arena of space? And our motive was to say, yes, we not only could compete, but we could excel and be first. And that was the purpose of the program, to achieve preeminence in space. President Kennedy, one of the greatest competitors our country has known, he was sick and tired of being second. I sometimes have said if the moon wasn't there, we'd have had to create one of our own, because we needed a goal, you need an objective, you need something you can focus on. And that's what the moon allowed us to do.
Kennedy's commitment set in motion the greatest mobilization of industry ever undertaken in peacetime. Man's first voyage to the moon would require the services of over 400,000 American workers. Abandoned war factories sprang to life as rocket assembly plants. In Connecticut, loving hands fashioned prototype spacesuits. In Alabama, a hosiery mill became a laboratory for guidance systems. And near Cocoa Beach, Florida, a desolate stretch of sand was transformed into $1 million launching pad. Quickly, shapes for a new age began to emerge. The newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, called its labors Project Mercury, and by 1958, 7 heroes had been found to match the hardware. The Mercury astronauts were introduced to America. Time magazine said, from a nation of 175 million, they stepped forward last week, 7 men cut of the same stone as Columbus, Magellan, Daniel Boone, and the Wright brothers. NASA did not discourage this adulation. In fact, the original 7 were actively portrayed as all-American Boy Scouts. While this image gained widespread support for Project Mercury, it was a bit simplistic. Actually, there were 7 widely diverse individuals, sharing only a common background as professional pilots. Ambitious, aggressive, competitive men, all eager to take this next step into the heavens.
I think all of those who volunteered, and certainly all of those who ended up in the finals like I did, really sort of looked at it as an extension of what they were doing. You see, as a test pilot, you sort of keep flying bigger and better and faster and farther and higher, etc., etc. In other words, you're expanding, as we call it, the boundary of the envelope being the curve describing the where thou shalt not pass if you're flying an airplane. And I think all of the original 7 looked at it that way. It's not a brand new frontier, really. It's just taking what we have and pushing it out. And I think all of us looked at it as a natural extension of what we've been doing, flying strange-looking airplanes and that sort of thing.
Most of the original 7 had learned to face danger directly as fighter pilots during the Korean conflict. They called themselves fighter jocks, roaring aloft in F-86s to wax the tails of Soviet MiGs over the Yalu River. After the war, the fighter jocks took their skill and daring home to become test pilots in remote outposts like Edwards Air Force Base. Here, over bleak, sun-drenched airfields, they discovered the danger had not diminished. A machine that looked good on the drawing boards might turn out to be a brick with wings. This job required what author Tom Wolfe calls the right stuff.
Well, the right stuff is the form of bravery that is required of a pilot, because the pilot is somebody who is expected to go out day after day in a hurtling piece of machinery and hang his hide out over the edge and then bring it back at the last sort of yawning moment, and then go out again the next day and the next day and every next day and do it in an infinite series if necessary. So it's not just simply being willing to risk your life. The idea is any fool can do that, just as any fool can throw his life away. You have to have the moxie to hang it out over the edge and pull it back.
For those in the righteous brotherhood, the challenge of flight test was exhilarating, handling critical situations with aplomb, then going right back up to gain even greater proficiency in the air.
These were people who put a great premium on piloting skills. The pilot took the plane up. He was always in control of its direction, and he would land it. Those were the three key things of being a pilot. So when the Mercury program was announced, there were people at Edwards Air Force Base, which was Right Stuff Central, who began referring to it as the spam in the can program. The idea being that the astronaut would just be a guinea pig, and he would be wired with biosensors to see how his physiological systems reacted. It'd be like a lab rabbit. It's interesting to see how the Mercury astronauts themselves rebelled against that. They wanted a hatch that could be opened from the inside, instead of having to be let out by a bunch of swabos with lug wrenches, which is the way the thing was set up. They said, look, you're telling the world that we are terrific pilots, so we're going to act like pilots. So they began altering the experiment. It was marvelous.
In the spacecraft and out, the astronauts gradually gained more control of their destiny. In training, they prepared for emergency situations that only an experienced pilot could handle. In the field, they monitored the development of a power plant which would propel one of them into space. Competition was keen. All seven were eager to take that historic first flight. But after 28 months of training, two favorites had emerged, Alan Sheperd and John Glenn. Glenn was a hard-eyed Marine pilot from Ohio, the winner of 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses. He was the oldest, most experienced astronaut, a perfect choice to be the first American in space.
This is Charles Von Fremd at the astronaut suiting up room at Langley Field, Virginia. The 3 finalists, one of whom will make that 100-mile high, 250-mile trip downrange, are with us here at Langley today.
The magnitude of the whole program is what has impressed me more. There are many hundreds.
Glenn was also smooth on camera, a chore the others dreaded.
Involved in Mercury, it's a tremendous national effort. We're just on the fringes of going into space, and we have the whole, literally the whole universe ahead of us.
But first, lesser heroes would pave the way. Astro chimps were sent into space and returned safely. After extensive tests revealed them none the worse for wear, it was time to select a man to take the same trip. Surprisingly, that man turned out to be Alan Sheperd instead of John Glenn. Sheperd had won the competition. He would ride the first manned flight of the untried bird. Before dawn, on May 5th, 1961, a Redstone rocket was filled with liquid oxygen for the first step of a long journey.
I'd been living with that hardware since it was put together. I'd lived with it. It was an old buddy, and as I stepped out, I knew there were a lot of those pieces I was never going to see again. And so I just thought I'd step back and take a look at it for the last time.
Astronaut Alan Sheperd climbed aboard the Redstone for a long, uncertain wait.
He had been up there for more than 4 hours on top of the rocket, sitting there waiting for this 7-story shaft of highly volatile rocket propellant to be lit. Everyone was agonizing. Everyone who had anything to do with any system involved in the flight was just agonizing, because they really was a feeling that a brave man's life is on the line, and maybe it's my mistake will be the one that kills him. And as they were getting down to within 15 minutes of what would have been the launch, Sheperd could overhear a couple of the technicians talking about a gauge of some sort that, if it was malfunctioning, would have to be set manually, which would mean a 2-day delay. And he could see they were just on the verge of saying, well, we better not take any chances. And suddenly he gets on this circuit and he says, listen, I'm cooler than you are. Why don't you fix your little systems and light this candle? And that did it. They all said, well, he's obviously willing to take the chance. So they all kind of pulled themselves together, and they lit the candle.
Ignition. Liftoff.
Sheperd had been violently hurtled 100 miles into the air. Here, on the fringes of the stratosphere, He was not high enough to orbit, but his momentum carried him 250 miles out over the Atlantic to splashdown. 17 minutes after Shepard's flight had begun, it was over, and 12 hours later, he was in Washington, D.C., with Project Mercury's patron saint.
Alan Sheperd, the members of the House and Senate Space Committee who are with us today, and this decoration, which has gone from the ground up here.
While history would remember Shepard as first, ironically, John Glenn was destined for even greater fame. Glenn's schedule had put him in line for America's first orbital flight. A Russian cosmonaut had already circled the Earth. Glenn's flight became a Cold War crusade to even the score as America turned its eyes and ears toward Cape Canaveral.
57 seconds, John, standby to start. EPI on my mark. Mark. Roger, EPI is
Minus 45.
Status check, pressurization. You are go. Water systems.
Go.
Mercury capsule. Mercury umbilical clear. Engine start. Good Lord, ride all the way. Godspeed, John Glenn.
Turning around, and I could see the booster during turnaround just a couple of 100 yards behind me. It was beautiful. Oh, that view is tremendous.
John Glenn was in orbit 125 miles high and circling the Earth once every 88 minutes.
Roger, understand go for at least 7 orbits. The sunset was beautiful. It went down very rapidly.
Roger. That was sure a short day. Time passes rapidly, huh?
Yes, sir.
Suddenly, a problem. A warning light indicated that Glenn's heat shield might be loose. Without it, he would burn to dust in the 4,000-degree heat of re-entry. It was time for the lab rabbit to become a pilot.
05G switch manually. Do you understand? Roger, understand. I will have to make a manual 05G entry when it occurs and bring the scope in manually. Is that affirmed? That is affirmative. Friendship 7.
Mission Control stood by helplessly as high overhead, a tiny speck burned its way through the Earth's atmosphere.
This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside. Speed shooted on green, shoot it out in race condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful shoot. On out to emergency and the shoot looks very good.
A big sigh of relief to you, breather out here. You got it made. Hallelujah.
America reached out to touch its new champion. In New York City, 4 million people gave Glenn a ticker-tape parade, even larger than those given Lindbergh and MacArthur.
After Glenn's flight, he had a status that's really hard to remember now. He was such a hero. Just as David went out and slew the Philistine giant Goliath, Glenn was perceived as the David who had gone up against great odds to fight the Soviets in the sky. It looked as if the Soviets were so far ahead of us that they could start coming over with spacecraft and dropping nuclear weapons like rocks off a highway overpass down on, and there goes Lubbock, we just lost Terre Haute, you know, and this sort of thing. Well, Glenn was a man who had countered them up there in the heavens.
Think of this. I think it's wonderful. The Russians may have done it first, but we did it better.
What do you think of Mr. Glenn?
I think he's a wonderful, courageous American.
The space program had its heroes. Now full speed ahead to the moon. As new heroes emerge, Older ones pass on. In 1963, all the world mourned the tragic death of President John Kennedy. But the space program he had begun grew to maturity. American astronauts of the Gemini program perfected techniques that would be necessary for a voyage to the moon. 300 miles above the Earth, they learned to work and walk in the vacuum of space.
When you're in space, when you're walking in space or whatever, there's an overpowering silence. The only noise you hear is your own breath as you're breathing the oxygen in your suit, or maybe the oxygen flowing through, or maybe occasionally conversation. You don't hear engines of an airplane. You don't feel the acceleration. You only sense movement as almost like you're on a balloon, hundreds of miles above the Earth. And there's a poem called High Flight. And that poem itself relates probably better, written long before we ever went to the moon, long before man ever went into space. Perhaps it's more perspective of what some of the guys inwardly felt or thought, even if maybe some of our guys are unwilling to admit it.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. I've chased the wind with tumbling mirth. High, high above a ball of burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. While the astronauts practiced new skills in space, the world they looked down upon was full of old troubles.
So slaves, grandchildren can have respect promised to them. We're gonna march.
Poverty and prejudice weighed on the country's conscience. Politicians criticized the space race as an expensive, foolhardy adventure into the skies, when man's real problems were down on Earth.
You can tell these white folks that black folks ain't no fool.
I think it is exceedingly short-sighted to try to say, as politicians of the other persuasion quite often do, we should be spending our time and effort and money solving certain mundane problems on Earth. We certainly should. I don't disagree that we should be solving those problems. But to do it at the sacrifice of man's quest of the unknown is sheer folly. Man has an inconquerable and unquenchable thirst to explore.
Those who explore the unknown must live with the possibility of accident or even death. On a winter morning in 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee suited up for what was called a plugs out test to check all systems in a countdown rehearsal.
Balance couple on. Stop, push button, reset. I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect. Uh-oh. Got a fire in the spacecraft.
We had a sudden fire, and to this day, we don't know the specific cause of that fire. Obviously, a spark of some type started within a spacecraft. The pad crew reported back to pad leader, says, no, there was nothing that could be done. It was all black in there, and we know that we'd had a bad accident. It turned out the 3 men were dead.
the loss of those guys was very heavy, and in particular, I was very close to Roger and his family. And I think if it did anything, it spurred a desire within the guys in the program to not only not give up, but spurred a desire to do the job even better.
Good pilots, buried and gone, but their spirit flies on with the right stuff, on toward the moon. The moon, goddess of the night. Nothing has so captured the eye and mind of man. On summer days, she haunts the daytime sky. On winter nights, she dominates our dark dreams. Her changing face marks our weeks and months, and she orders the tides of Earth's oceans. She beckons and all things respond. What makes the grunion run? What brings the starfish out to feed? What alone eclipses the sun? The moon. So enchanting, so mysterious, and so far away that only in his dreams could man touch her barren beauty. By the end of 1967, America had created the power to reach the dream. The Saturn V rocket was the largest, most powerful machine ever made. A treaded transporter, as big around as a baseball infield, was built to move the rocket from the assembly building to the launch pad. The transporter was as tall as a football field set on end, and it moved no faster than 1 mile per hour over a special stone crawlerway. The immense weight of the rocket and the transporter crushed the stone into a fine sand as it rolled toward the pad. The Saturn V rocket, the 6 million pound machine. But would it fly? Millions of years ago, life emerged from the sea. Now it had the power to touch the stars.
The first launch of Saturn V was in effect a culmination of some 6 years of work on Saturn V, many, many more years of work in the field of rocketry.
T-minus 45 seconds and counting.
That morning, the count proceeded beautifully, and I must say that moment of liftoff, to me, represented in many ways the true opening up of the space age.
30 seconds and counting. Switching rocket over to internal power and command.
Status check. Command on internal.
Affirmative.
Telemetry and launch condition.
Affirmative.
Missile and internal DC.
Affirmative.
Pressurization complete.
Affirmative. Count it down. 19, 18.
Poised against the Florida sky stood enough raw power to carry man to the moon.
12, 11.
This first flight was unmanned, but the tension was extreme. For if the Saturn V failed, the moon would remain beyond man's reach.
1, 0, ignition. Go.
6 million pound machine actually flew 24,000 miles an hour, 10 times faster than a rifle bullet. 150 million horsepower. Gas mileage, 5 inches to the gallon. The Saturn V soared into the uncharted depths of space. And the manned flights that followed took Apollo program astronauts farther from home than any man had ever been, to see things no man had ever seen. Inside the spacecraft, the journey toward the moon went on in a state of weightlessness, a condition that added a curious new dimension to the daily routine. Man had broken the gravitational bonds that had bound him to Earth since creation. Now he would get his first glimpse of another world. The moon has no atmosphere, and therefore no weather, no wind, no clouds, no water, no sound, no life. Project Apollo gave man his first look at the dark side of the moon. But in 1968, there was a dark side to the Earth as well.
We find ourselves rich in goods, but ragged in spirit, reaching with magnificent precision for the moon, but falling into raucous discord on Earth. We are caught in war, wanting peace. We're torn by division, wanting unity. We see around us empty lives, wanting fulfillment.
You know, people in this country work 10 years to buy a lousy Cadillac, just to buy a car to keep up with the Joneses. Why don't we think about how our brother is suffering?
We were involved in a lot of civil strife, a lot of campus unrest. We were involved in a very unpopular war. And the one single thing that this country could hold its head up and be proud of was the accomplishments of the Apollo program.
Apollo 8, this is Houston, 3 minutes.
On Christmas Eve, 1968, astronauts James Lovell, William Anders, and Frank Borman were in lunar orbit. As America hurried home to its holiday meal, the headlines were not of Vietnam or social strife, but rather of the space age's biggest gamble.
The Apollo 8 mission really was an extremely courageous undertaking, and there was very much on the minds of people within NASA that they might end up with 3, if the thing went wrong, they might end up with 3 dead astronauts run out of oxygen, circling, endlessly orbiting the moon while Silent Night played on Christmas Eve.
All systems are go, Apollo 8. Apollo 8 coming to you live from the moon.
Instead of 3 dead astronauts, Apollo 8 gave the world a Christmas message it would never forget.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God called the dry land earth. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Из 250 миллионов советских граждан
Russia also had the power to reach the moon. In fact, cosmonauts had logged even more hours in deep space than astronauts. But under a cloak of secrecy, Soviet technology had fallen behind. Then tragedy struck. 3 cosmonauts were found dead in their spacecraft upon re-entry because Soviet pressure suits had not yet been developed. Their funeral in Red Square marked the end of the space race. As Russian hopes faded away, the Apollo astronauts lined up for a trip to the moon. Soon one would be chosen to be the ultimate explorer, the first to stand on another celestial body and look back on Earth. This was a new breed of astronaut, but old original Alan Sheperd was still on hand to make sure they also had the right stuff.
Yes, there was an evolution in the selection process over the years, but the real meat of the guy's ability to perform under stress, I don't think those requirements have changed. I don't think they should change, because there's still going to be a pressure situation. You know, it's still not a piece of cake up there. There's still a chance to buy the farm.
Training had grown more sophisticated. Machines were designed to simulate every aspect of space flight, even weightlessness. The candidates also traveled the world. In Iceland, they studied geology. For Earth survival training, they dined on python meat in the jungles of South America and fashioned clothing for parachutes in the Nevada desert. Each man had his own reason for going through it all.
I can remember as a young lad growing up in Pennsylvania, on those clear nights, rare clear nights when I could see the moon, you know, it did have a fascination for me, and I had the strangest feeling someday I was going to be able to go there. And then there was the aspect of maybe there's fame and maybe there's fortune, and because it did look like the astronauts were, man, they were making a lot of money, and I'm not above that.
Pilots do not give an appearance of having well-developed egos, but they do. In fact, I think they're in a league with heart surgeons, and that's fast company.
Every aviator you talk to is the best in the world. I'm the best aviator in the world. You can talk to Al or to anybody else, and you're going to get the same answer. And we have to feel that way. It's not egotistic to believe that, but it is a form of ego that allows you to do the job as good or better than anyone else who has ever done it.
We knew we were good. We knew we were the best in our profession. But we also wanted that next flight. We were not paragons of virtue necessarily. We were very competent, hardworking, highly motivated engineers and test pilots with a goal in mind. And the competition of being the next one selected the competition was always high. Generally in a friendly way, and sometimes not in such a friendly way. It was a very high-spirited group of people.
In the end, it was not competition, but simple rotation of crews that decided which flight would make the first lunar landing. Apollo 11 was chosen, and Michael Collins had been selected for that crew 2 years previously. Collins was a friendly, outgoing man who dreaded the tedium of NASA meeting rooms. His crewmate, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, was studious, the first astronaut with a PhD in astronautics. Co-workers claimed he could correct a computer. Apollo 11's commander was Neil Armstrong, the best pilot among the astronauts, perhaps in the world. As a boy in Ohio, he had learned to fly before he was old enough to drive. At 29, he was selected by the brass at Edwards to test the mighty X-15. This supersonic plane was carried aloft by transport, and Armstrong set speed records of over 4,000 miles per hour. Flying the odd lunar landing module seemed like quite a come-down, but during training runs in this bug-like contraption, Armstrong discovered that it would provide the most dangerous test of his piloting skills. Armstrong parachuted to safety, but failures like this cast a shadow of doubt over Apollo 11.
Going through our training runs, there are times when we'd crash. There was a period of time where it seemed for a month we couldn't put our act together. It came to the point where I think even management had lost their confidence in us. Then about 1 month prior to the actual launch, we put it all back together again. Without going through that humbling exercise, we learned a lot of lessons there. We make our mistakes in training such that we don't make them in the real game.
The objective of this flight is precisely to take man to the moon, make a landing there, and return. That is the objective. How we'll use that information in the centuries to come, only history will tell.
Behind lay a decade of preparation and $24 billion. Ahead stretched 240,000 miles of unwritten history.
God of all space, who has set the stars in their courses, and who dost also dwell in the human heart. God of the light years, infinite beyond infinity, we give thee thanks, O God, for the rights with which thou hast endowed us, for the love of truth and the dreams of adventure which propel pioneers out into space. Make our country a worthy leader of the free world. Amen.
Everybody, it's a beautiful morning for a trip to the moon. Thousands of spectators are converging on Cape Kennedy today to watch the launch of Apollo 11. The blastoff will be televised worldwide by satellite.
Never before had so many people been eyewitness to history. Not the windless morning Columbus sailed with the riches of Isabella. Not on the foggy dawn Lindbergh throttled up to face the Atlantic. Not the frigid night Admiral Byrd pressed into the Arctic. But on this warm, humid day in Florida, millions of people would watch the final step of mankind's greatest adventure.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
Roger, roll. Roger, 11, we'll pass that on, and it certainly looks like you're well on your way now.
And so, 3 young Americans have set forth on a human adventure of mythological proportions, with London and the rest of the civilized world invited to watch on television, for better or worse.
Le lancement de l'astronef Apollo 11 a réussi et les astronautes américains sont partis vers la Lune. 本日早くアメリカ宇宙飛行士ネイル・アームストロング、バス・オードリン、マイク・コリングス。
Dr. Abernathy, what was in your mind just as you saw the rocket lift off?
There was a great deal of joy and pride for that particular moment and second. I really forgot the fact that we have so many hungry people in the United States of America.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are confirmed to go for orbit. Those are kind words, Robert. We're go for orbit here.
Status check in mission control. Coming up all greens on the flight director's console.
We confirm ignition and the thrust is go.
800 million people in 59 different nations heard or watched the astronauts by radio or television. At a moment's notice, earthly pursuits were set aside to view daily progress reports from Apollo 11's 4-day journey to the moon.
We are very comfortable up here, though. We do have a happy home. There's plenty of room for the three of us, and I think we're all learning to find our favorite little corner to sit in.
And Apollo 11 continues on schedule. Tomorrow, Armstrong and Aldrin will board the Eagle landing craft and wait for lunar landing clearance from Flight Director Gene Kranz.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido. Go. Guidance. Go. Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC. Go.
Right,
Copy. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
We're go. Same height. We're go.
Good radar data. Altitude now 33,500 feet. We didn't know why it had happened, but we knew we had a downrange error in our trajectory. We had moved further along the ground track for some reason, but it would require the crew to manually take over and land that spacecraft. They couldn't go down to the point where we had planned. They'd have to actually work their way through a boulder field.
Eagle Houston, to request manual start override.
After 4 days as a passenger, Neil Armstrong was now called on to do the one thing he knew he was truly best at. He was flying.
10 and 50 feet down at 4. 30, 3.5 down. Altitude, velocity, light, 3.5 down. 220 feet. Forward. 100 feet, 3.5 down. 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good. Down a half. Down 2.5. Forward. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 40 feet down, 2.5. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Picking up some dust. Great shadow. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I had to speak and couldn't, and finally I took and hit my hand in the console, and it hurt so much that I finally just broke out of it. And I think all the other controllers went through their communications climax at that point. And then the sound from around us, from our training instructors and the people in the viewing room, you heard them clapping and applauding and cheering. And it sort of dawned on you that, my God, we had actually landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, Houston, I'm on the porch. Roger, Neil. We can see you coming down the ladder now. Yeah, I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Feel that this stands as a symbol of the insatiable curiosity of all mankind to explore the unknown. Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States would like to say a few words to you. Over.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
I do remember the scene very vividly, but I certainly recall looking at the Earth, and one can't help but being impressed by its small dimensions in that situation.
Tranquility Base, Houston. You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. Roger.
After Armstrong and Aldrin, 10 other American astronauts walked on the moon, and not one has ever forgotten the power of that moment.
I have never yet looked at that moon without having some thought going through my mind about how it was up there. It is so unique, it is so totally different, that I'll never, ever forget what it was like. When you go to the moon, which has been there for about 4 billion years, and you walk out and realize that there's been no person there for 4 billion years, that nobody has seen these rocks before, and there you are collecting these things that have been sitting there for 4 billion years. It's really hard to correlate that in terms of today's time.
I think for myself, the most profound and provocative aspect was the change from having an intellectual understanding about the immensity of the universe and the tiny place that planet Earth occupies in it, but moving that understanding from an intellectual sense to a deep gut sense as I was able to look out and see how finite the Earth is.
You know, to see the earth as God must view the earth and realize how special it is, it just touched me in a very personal way. In fact, I had tears coming down my face as I was, because I guess it was a lifetime of anticipation, you know, a lifetime dream.
You can't stand on another planet 250,000 miles away and look back at this earth that is too large for us to realize its size and look at it like a marble in the sky. You can't look at a blackness so overpowering you didn't even know that kind of blackness existed. You can't realize that you're doing something that no one else has ever done before, and perhaps no one else may ever do again. You can't do all those things and come back and not think about it. When someone says, do you ever look back and think about the moon? And sure I do. I casually sometimes say, you know, hey, you know, see that place over in the little right-hand corner? That's where I live. And people sometimes look at me, and I stop and think of what I say. But I have been there. That's a place that I have been.